So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Herbert Pollock Lecture in the Humanities. Herbert Pollock was a W&L alum, class of 1925. He was an MD. He has established an endowment, an endowed fund to sponsor lectures at the university. 2 lectures a year, one in the humanities, one in the sciences. And this is the lecture in the humanities. The fund was created in the memory of 2 Washington and Lee professors. You have to remember, Dr. Pollock graduated in 1925, and these were his professors. So these are not people I have a strong memory of. One was Benjamin Delaware Easter, and my information is that he was a professor, I think, of languages. Does anyone know Professor Easter, or know of him? And the other one was Lucius Junius Deshay, who was a professor of chemistry. And I have it from John Gunn, who is the sort of walking institutional memory of W&L, that Professor Deshay was quite an influential figure on campus. So these talks are dedicated to the memory of these 2 professors, and this is the talk in the humanities. And I'm very honored to introduce to you Professor Nancy Sherman. She's University Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University, a fellow in the Kennedy Ethics Center at Georgetown. She has a Ph.D. in philosophy from Harvard, and MLit in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh. Her undergraduate degree was also in philosophy from Bryn Mawr. She was the inaugural Distinguished Chair of Ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy, and her work at the Naval Academy is part of what informs both the talk and the book that's for sale, just outside the doorway there. She also was assistant and then associate professor at Yale. She's a recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, published numerous articles in a variety of backgrounds on topics from the Stoics to Kant, even a paper on Hegel I think I saw in there early on. She's the author of a number of books. As I mentioned, Stoic Warriors is available outside and will be available in a reception to follow this talk, and you can get it signed as well at the reception. The reception will be in the living room upstairs in Elrod Commons. She's also author of Making a Necessity of Virtue, Aristotle and Kant on Virtue. That's a Cambridge book. And The Fabric of Character, Aristotle's Theory of Virtue. That's an Oxford book. And a book, she has a book forthcoming, The Untold War, Inside the Hearts, Minds, and Souls of Our Soldiers, which is going to be published by W.W. Norton. And out in, what, Nancy, about a year or something like that? Keep your eyes out for The Untold War. Today's talk is on the guilt that soldiers carry, and help me welcoming Nancy Sherman, please.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and I want to thank especially Greg, who's coming down now, Angie Smith, who's visiting, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you better, and Sharon Kirk, who's been so helpful in setting this up. Many have told me about Washington and Lee, but this is my first visit down here. It's quite beautiful. Those of us with prejudices about the North see that southern campuses are every bit as beautiful, so it really is lovely. So we put this here. This paper that and set of remarks that I'll be giving to you today is part of the forthcoming book called The Untold War. The progress I made on Stoic Warriors, or I should say I got stuck, and I wanted to continue listening to soldiers' voices, especially since we are in the midst of 2 wars. And so I've been interviewing soldiers, not the usual drill for a philosopher. I live right between Walter Reed Hospital and Bethesda Naval Hospital, so I've been interviewing soldiers often on their return, but as it happens, because of what I've been doing for the past 10 years or so, or 15 years, since I did a stint at the Naval Academy, I have lots of friends that have been deployed or have come home, or that want to talk about war even if they haven't been recently in war but are Vietnam vets or the like. So my ears have been open. Something that doesn't often come up in my CV or the introductions is I have training as a psychoanalyst. So that's also part of the background of the way I listen and hear some of these voices, and particularly today's topic on guilt. You'll pick that up, I think. In thinking about this subject, I just want to situate it. Often, if you're talking about military ethics in a philosophy curriculum, you're talking about just war and the tradition of just war theory that maybe goes back to Augustine, 3rd century, Common Era, or even earlier. You can find references in the Bible. Certainly Cicero talks about it earlier, 1st century, Common Era. But if you were to move over into another discipline, into psychology, clinical psychology, you'd probably be talking about, and you're talking about after war, you'd be talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but you don't need that name to know what it is or that it was around earlier. It's in Homer's Iliad, certainly. It's the anguish that soldiers bear after war. Just to keep some figures in your head, they're in the background of my thoughts. But 1 in 3 soldiers return, we now know from these current engagements, with some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The signature illness of the current wars is TBI, traumatic brain injury, concussive shaking of the brain and the cranium from IEDs, improvised explosive devices, or other kinds of homemade bombs. And also there's still a lot of resistance to seeking mental help, though we're doing much, much better in destigmatizing injury. And post-traumatic stress disorder probably is misnamed. It's an injury. You would never call someone who came home from war without a limb having a limb disorder, but we persist in using the word psychological disorder, and that itself is stigmatizing, and nothing soldiers want to easily bear. So the public also needs to be responsible here, as well as the healing professions. So what I'm about to talk about today is a part of these upcoming work, and also based on lots of interviews I've conducted, about 35 or so, with soldiers at different points in their careers. So I'll begin with a visit I made to Annapolis a few years ago, and I was talking to a chaplain, a Navy chaplain, who was in an ethics center at the time, not deployed. This chaplain said that he had talked to thousands of Marines as they prepare for war, deploy, and return home. And he said to me, quote, "Probably the thing that was most difficult," am I audible to all? It sounds good to hear. Okay. "The thing most difficult to get the men ready for," and he said they were all men to the person in the case of his units, was understanding life and death. The junior troops, the lance corporals, and even sergeants had never really seen battle. Many of them, up until that point, had never even fired a weapon at another human being. So just about to a man, and I was with an all-male unit, he adds, they all wanted to find out, will God still appreciate me if I pull the trigger on another human being? Now, these Marines that I was talking about, and in this case a Navy chaplain, don't use the word guilt, but that's what they worry about. That's what he worried about, and that's what his men worried about. How will they judge themselves or be judged by a higher being for what they do in war? Their worries to the person, and no one I've talked to has been worried about war crimes or indiscriminate killing, i.e. killing in malice. They trust they won't commit such acts. They worry about what they regard, by and large, by today's standards, and that itself is open to some dispute, just killing. That is, it's the prospect of that kind of killing, what's considered just in war, that doesn't sit easy. Other military personnel worry about or struggle with guilt feelings for acts which are not, again, legally or morally culpable. So you'll hear in a moment about an Army major who was in charge of an infantry company in Iraq, and he told me in an interview some 3 years after he returned that he struggles with his own, he did use the word guilt, he was the only person that has, his own personal guilt with the accident in which a Bradley tank misfired and killed one of his own privates. And others struggle for transgressions in, that in peacetime circumstances would not be okay, but in wartime circumstances are. So here I'm thinking about an 80-year-old something person who was in World War II, and he still remembers that the beachhead was far from glorious. It was awful, he says. As soon as they landed, they looted the bodies of their own dead. Stripping the dead even of arms offended his civilian mentality. So what is not okay as a civilian is okay as a soldier, and crossing that border can feel like a moral trespass, even though it isn't. The psychological dissonance is there, though there really isn't. Though once you're in the area of the uniform in war, it's morally permissible. Another friend spoke in this way of her father, who served in the Canadian Army in World War II, and she came across a pile of letters, a trove of letters that she began pouring through. He said, he was talking about eating chickens in Germany. They needed food. And he said, naturally, we didn't steal the chickens. We just happened to be passing by when the chickens flew into our vehicles. So, as his daughter put it to me, even in the simple matter of having enough to eat, her father had to make rationales for what offended his moral sensibilities. Another Veterans Administration doc said that a patient was perfectly fine until the patient started remembering that when he approached a dead body of the enemy and he pulled out the wallet was filled with family portraits. And as the psychiatrist said, the family portraits presumably reminded him of his own children. They could have been mine, and that just unleashed an empathic moment with profound guilt. So these are examples we'll see more in a moment, and they just begin to give you a sense of the Janus-faced conception that guilt is. We typically think of it as focused on the past and on the thought that you wronged another, or that you're going to contemplate wronging another, and so you have that bite of guilt, as it's sometimes called, the pang of guilt. But individuals, as we know well, can feel guilt about actions for which they're not at all at fault, and yet for which they nonetheless see themselves as responsible. And in some cases, a philosopher would say we're causally responsible. We were in the chain of events that caused it, but not morally responsible. And so it may be the result of non-culpable ignorance, that in this case, like the Bradley case, that the gun went off. Or it may be a collateral damage case where you kill, you don't intend to kill, but you foresee that it might happen as the unintended consequence of your act. We'll see those kinds of cases. In other cases, it's just knowingly and intentionally killing in war that still doesn't seem to jibe easily with a soldier's humanity. It seems almost a transgression of humanity. So I want to suggest that guilt for these kinds of actions seems both rational and irrational. Personal agency is implicated, but there may be legitimate excuses and indeed justification. But I want to emphasize that even when there's irrational guilt, and we might say unreasonably excessive guilt, something that a clinician would try to reduce in a patient, the guilt still seems to be admirable, an important sign of the soldier's humanity. And that's the point I want to underscore, that it's admirable, that it's a sign of the fact that a soldier does not always feel comfortable using lethal force, And it's a sign of the fact that a soldier often feels that the way to reclaim personal autonomy in an organization that's bureaucratic and often squeezes out your autonomy is through these feelings of guilt. So it's an important and not just symbolic moment of personal autonomy and responsibility. So as I was saying, the guilt that can be admirable can easily turn excessive and pathological. And Nietzsche warns, standing morality on its head, bad conscience, he says, can become torture without end, undoing any prospects for happiness. It's a familiar thought about the pang and pain of guilt. Freud famously elaborated upon the theme. He says, enduring the recriminations of a harsh superego, that's his term for conscience, is the cost of civilization. You might say wrath is punishment wrath is punishment outward, that rage and anger, warrior's anger I was talking about in class a moment ago. That's punishment outward. Guilt is punishment inward, a kind of self-indictment of having harmed or violated or betrayed another. It's an accusation and conviction against self for actions done. Now, I certainly, when I began my work and when I talk to people casually, the thought that often comes up is that we worry about war desensitizing warriors and about soldiers getting used to killing and accepting how cheap life can be. And this may happen to some, but that wasn't the prevalent theme I've heard in my years of talking to soldiers. The soldiers I've talked to feel the tremendous weight and guilt of their actions. And indeed, many soldiers, as I've said, seem to extend their responsibility, their culpability, beyond what's reasonably within their dominion. And even, I might say, to the point where some commanders try to alleviate it in their soldiers. Now, for all of this, the subject of guilt doesn't come up easily in talking to soldiers. I'd say it's the elephant in the room. And it is so in part because guilt feelings are often born with shame feelings. Shame, like guilt, is also an emotion directed inward at yourself, and it typically involves condemnation and accusation of failure. Yet its focus, unlike guilt, is not so much on my wronging another, violating another in some way, but on my own personal defects, or maybe diminished character, diminished status, that often seems to be exposed before other eyes. Aristotle talks about sort of it being right out there, as if my fig leaf is taken off. The Greek word for shame is idola. Your genitalia are exposed. There's no fig leaf to cover up. So, but I want to, despite how intriguing shame is, and many philosophers talk about it, I want to talk about guilt today, and in part because on the battlefield where the destruction of others is the modus vivendi, guilt for causing that suffering is inescapable. So I will come to the battlefield momentarily, but let me give you a little meandering, if I can, or let me meander on my own here in my words. A little bit about Kant, a little bit more about Freud on guilt. So we might say, if we're modernists and we look to the 18th century, that Kant sets the scene in the modern world for the vigil of conscience. Under Kant, the ancient dictum, Socrates' dictum, to know thyself becomes, in Kant's words, the first command of all duties to oneself. It's actually a highest order duty, it's a kind of meta duty, to scrutinize, fathom your heart, he says, for the rightness of conduct and the purity of motive. So the self becomes both the judge and the judged. You're looking at yourself as a judge would. But interestingly, despite this focus on self and self-judgment, Kant is neither particularly interested in what from ancient times forward has been often called the bite of conscience. That term bite is in is in the literature from Cicero on and even earlier. Nor is he really interested in the fear of punishment. So that sense that guilt brings about, there's a pang and that you feel the fear of what the heavens might rot if you do something bad, if you get caught with the hand in the cookie jar, that sort of thing. That's not really in Kant. And I think the absence is quite deliberate. What Kant's thinking about is mature conscience. And mature conscience has the kind of feeling before it of respect. It's respect for, or reverence in the sense of attention, Achtung in German, and submission to yourself as a lawgiver, to yourself as a legislator. And so Kant imagines that we're in that position of lawmakers, and we're not despots nor capricious lawmakers or tyrants, but just lawmakers, fair lawmakers, and we're standing ready at attention, capable of following a just law, a fair law. And so one of the reasons that Kant doesn't talk much about moral bites and gnaws and the anguish and pain is that he's more interested in respect, I think, than the fear that goads and bullies. And he actually tells us, beware of self-loathing. He's a pietist, and he's raised as a Protestant pietist, and he's quite worried about re-importing that into his philosophy. It shouldn't get too melancholic. It shouldn't be too difficult and self-tortured. There shouldn't be loathing is part of what he's interested in. But I think in all this, Kant doesn't really appreciate that harsh self-judgment isn't necessarily piety or self-righteousness or thinking too much about your own virtue and getting too melodramatic about it. It seems to me that in war, it can be that kind of self-judgment is inseparable from empathy with those we harm and a sense of responsibility and duty of reparation, even when the harm is not intentional. And soldiers, as inflictors of the horror of war, often bear this kind of judgment, complete with its bite and its anguish. It's not righteousness or pious melancholy they're feeling. It's kind of a feeling a soldier, as a philosopher sometimes say, moral remainder, that there is it's a reasonable reaction to being human and to having one's humanity compromised because of the conflicts that one catches oneself in. Now, we might think that Freud can do better than Kant in recognizing the rationality of guilt for actions that are not strictly speaking culpable. And he does in some ways, but not entirely. So if you remember, sort of Freud kind of gives a developmental story, a just so story, that is almost like the background of Kant's. And Freud's story is that our conscience is the product of a childhood battle of sorts. And we, as children, want both parental love but fear its loss, and fear repudiation and punishment when we do wrong and, as Freud says, are found out. And with proper moral growth and independence, we move that tension inside ourselves from outside. We don't need a parent to kind of wiggle the finger. We can do it ourselves with our superegos, and we become vigilant self-judges. And so guilt, on Freud's view, is a kind of leftover tension from childhood. Its predominant feeling is fear and punishment and retaliation. But if you note, Freud doesn't really give us any reason for thinking that what we've internalized is morality rather than just a bullying self. We bully ourselves. You know, you can bully yourself and be a harsh tormentor without justification, just as military leaders can, cruel military leaders, or cruel parents can be. So what the move from outside to inside does do, and Freud's right about this, is it sets up a garrison inside. You are watching yourself. There's no doubt about it. That's Freud's whole point. You're watching yourself. But Freud, and that's why you have to repress, because there's a lot to watch that you don't want to see. But without some clever philosophical patching up of his theory, which I can't do right here, Freud doesn't really explain why some self-indictments from that watchdog inside have at their base guilt that is more rooted in morality than just a harsher bullying superego. So that's sort of a point about Freud that I think takes us just so far, but not that much further. So that takes me to think a little bit more about Army Major John Pryor, who had an accident, a horrific accident, with the misfiring of a Bradley. So let me tell you a little bit about this. I was a few years ago at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and he was still in uniform, and he came in and he sat down and he said, "I lost a soldier, which was extremely traumatic." And then he began to talk to me. He said, quote, "One of the Bradleys misfired. It was on the front gate and had a malfunction, and it took off a third of one of my private's faces. It was as if an ice cream scoop just scooped out his face. He survived the initial blast, if you can believe it. We were in the medic tent with him. It was one of the most traumatic things I've ever seen in my entire life, to literally see someone's face completely scooped out, to just see the very bottom of his jaw working. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear, he couldn't scream. I mean, he had no eyes, obviously, no face. I can only imagine the terror, the fear, the pain he was in. He obviously couldn't breathe because he had no nose or mouth to take in air. It was one of the few times in my life I've really cried. Tears were just streaming down my face because I'm watching 10 people work on this kid. It was an unbelievable thing to see. It was one of those images that will be in your head until you die. The aftermath of that was the guilt of the situation, because I'm the one that placed the vehicles there. I'm the one who set the security. Like most accidents, I'm not in jail right now. Clearly, I wasn't egregiously responsible. But it's a comedy of errors. Any one of a dozen decisions made over the course of a 2-month period, and none of them really occurs to you at the time. Any one of those made differently may have saved his life. So I dealt with it and still deal with it every day. The guilt of having cost him his life, essentially. There's probably not a day that doesn't go by that I don't think about it, at least fleetingly. Now, the malfunction, as Major Pryor explains to me in layman terms, had to do with the replacement battery that was used. They used a Marine battery instead of an Army battery, and while the voltage was the same as the original one, the amperage was different, and the amperage made all the difference. It jumped when the guy who was the driver turned on the ignition. It jumped a certain switch, and it immediately turned on the turret that fired the barrage that took off, in this case, Private Mayek's face. Pryor was formally I should add that the Army doesn't use that battery anymore, not surprisingly. Pryor was formally investigated by the military and ultimately exonerated. And by the standards of the legal and moral community, he's not guilty in the sense of culpable or at fault. Yet he carries guilt and holds himself responsible. And he says, as I said, on a personal note, I feel the personal guilt all the time. In an important way, I want to say Pryor's guilt is not irrational. We understand it, as I suggested earlier, and admire it, I think. And I think we'd think less of him if he didn't feel it. If as a commander in charge of Private Mayek's life, ready to lead troops and have them follow, we'd think less of him if he viewed what happened as just an accident, a flukish accident, only remotely connected with his choices. Maybe the guilt is reparation for harm done. It records something morally significant that marks his deep connection to others and his accountability to them. and to himself. And it's not just, I want to emphasize, a response to the fact that he's causally responsible, that he's the guy that put the stuff there and he gave the orders. He feels morally implicated. And yet, still for all this, the guilt, maybe it's moral, but it's excessive. It oversteps moral accountability. It was an accident, and yet it's an accident where he feels himself morally accountable for bringing about bad consequences he couldn't reasonably expect or prevent.